Hello, I'm Graham Coote. This is my presentation on self-disclosure. Therapist self-disclosure, often referred to as TSD, is often considered as controversial. The father of psychology, Sigmund Freud, maintained that the only effective way to proceed with analysis was through the three pillars of analytic stance: anonymity, abstinence, and neutrality. Perhaps it was to maintain an air of superiority, a greater wisdom over the client, demanding blind subordination to the master's treatment. Whatever the reason, 100 years have passed and therapists consider that they operate in a more enlightened world these days. With the rise of the contemporary psychodynamic schools, starting with Carl Rogers' client-centered model, connection and an empathetic understanding of the client allow greater transparency and disclosure between therapist and client. Gibson, 2012. Almost all therapists report that they disclose some information about themselves to clients at least some of the time, with no consistent differences based on gender. That's Henretti and Levitt, cited by Gibson, 2012. Implicit self-disclosure. Disclosure is not always something volunteered by the therapist. As humans, we deduce information about people from the clothes they wear, the style of their hair, perhaps their furniture, certainly the decor of their consulting room, their tidiness, what kind of technology they use. Sometimes disclosure can simply be a matter of offering reassurance, as in, I understand what you're saying because I have experienced a similar situation, or I'm familiar of the type of situation you're talking about. And in the 21st century, with all its social media, it's almost impossible to maintain absolute privacy. It would not be hard for a client to form a profile image of the therapist simply from freely available databases, for example, graduation records. Just ask Google. Today, therapists may need to think more about what information they need to guard against disclosure than thinking about disclosure. That too comes from Gibson, 2012. Why self-disclose? What are the pluses for self-disclosure? With modelling, with open engagement and easy manner, even when discussing uncomfortable issues, the client is encouraged to do likewise. Modelling can include the validation of emotions with disclosures such as, I'd feel the same, it's okay to feel such and such, assuring the client that his or her emotions are acceptable and perfectly understandable. The therapist, by example, creates an environment where self-revelation is acceptable, which encourages the client to do likewise. Creating the therapeutic alliance. The therapist creates an environment where self-revelation is acceptable and self-disclosure encourages that. If the client asks personal questions which the therapist ignores or dismisses, it could well have an adverse effect on the client, who may infer that he or she was not worthy of a truthful answer. In contrast, an open answer builds a close alliance and a better therapeutic environment. Validating reality. The therapist needs to be open about the reality of the therapy, his or her health or otherwise, time limitations, the space, and also to acknowledge the client's observations. To be genuine. A failure to acknowledge the client in this way can form barriers to openness. Encouraging the client's feeling of equality. Forming a relationship between equals, not something a client would have expected from Freud. Mitigating therapeutic impasse. Misunderstandings or feelings of not being understood or an impasse in the conversation can be easily resolved by being open. Repairing developmental deficits. If the client was raised to fear or not question an authority figure, a free and open relationship can allow the client to try out new behaviours. Being there for a moment of humanity. This allows for expression of genuine caring and compassion when necessary. The author, Cohen, she had a client who had just experienced the death of her 28-year-old daughter in a tragic accident. Of course, it was a time to show humanity. Helping clients to learn about themselves. The client's resistance to therapy can be caused by not knowing about elements of self, In openness, the client can be exposed to previous hidden parts. It's Cohen, 2005. Research. There are volumes of studies, research papers, statistical analyses covering the subject of self-disclosure. Some use the therapist as the subjects, some the clients, and some are analogue in design, using psychology students as their subjects. That's Hill and Knox, 2001. Some studies have looked at the implication for TSD in group therapy, some at where the client and the therapist are of different genders, or the same genders, at different ages and at different cultures. Jeffrey and Tweed, 2015, postulated from their study in LGB therapy that disclosure of the therapist's sexuality may be particularly beneficial for members of stigmatized populations to facilitate strengthening of the therapeutic alliance and to enhance congruence with the client. However, their sample size was small and the subjects were clinicians rather than clients. The idea that stigmatized groups such as LGBTQI prefer to work with people who can demonstrate either that their sexuality is aligned with this group or that they have done considerable work with similar groups and have an understanding of the relevant issues. In some cases, the clinic might promote that experience as a strategy to support positive change. Gibson, 2010. Clients who have experienced violence, PTSD or abuse would certainly be cautious about the therapist with whom they are expected to open up to. Limits of self-disclosure. If therapy reaches a point where the therapist needs the client to fulfill some need, that is to be idolised, validated or applauded, then the therapist's needs might dominate and treatment needs to be reviewed. If the client asks too many questions, gets aggressive, rhetorical, defensive or intrusive, the therapist needs to comment more on the process than answering the questions. The client's needs might become cloying, and these are times not to disclose. So in conclusion, we've looked at the controversy surrounding self-disclosure, we've looked at implicit disclosure and how it can be difficult to maintain anonymity. We looked at the positive aspects, the existing research, and the effects of self-disclosure for stigmatised and marginalised communities. When self-disclosure goes too far and when to back off. Almost all therapists report that they disclose some information about themselves to clients at least some of the time, with no consistent differences by gender. My proposition that the question is not whether to disclose or not to disclose, that is, whether it is morally or ethically correct or not, neither is it a question of whether or not self-disclosure is effective or not. The situation involves two humans, one trying to help the other and support the other. The question is, will the disclosure help the client?